This is my 148th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is another rolling stock review and running session, this time of a quite unusual LMS locomotive which I was very pleased to be able to acquire, a model of a Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 23 saddle tank built by OO Works. The East Lancashire Railway recently held a gala to mark the centenary of the merger of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway and the London and North Western Railway, which occurred in 1922, just before the general amalgamation of 1923. In 1923, the L&YR, as part of that general amalgamation, became part of the LMS, and so all ex-L&YR rolling stock passed into LMS ownership. I would have been interested in this gala anyway, but as it happened, it occurred just as I was building a daypole kit of an L&YR Class 21040 Pug locomotive, planning to use the result as a lightweight loco model to serve as a load for my various railway cranes. See part 141 of this series for that build and the crane lifting. So I watched the video of the East Lancashire Centenary Gala with particular interest, initially focusing on details of the Class 21 Pug that they have, which was showcased quite extensively doing shunting. But whilst I was watching videos of this event, I noticed another locomotive, seen in the background here, in fact. This 060 saddle tank was something that I wasn't really familiar with, and I was definitely intrigued by it. My prototype for OO gauge modelling is LMS operations before World War II. If saddle tanks of this type were used by the L&YR Railway, they would have presumably passed into LMS ownership. And as such, they would represent a particularly interesting type. I've done my best to represent as widely as possible the rolling stock used by the LMS in my period, but I don't have anything in the way of an 060 saddle tank. Probably the best-known type of 060 saddle tank is the J94 austerity type, as seen here in British Railways livery. I must admit I rather had the wrong end of the stick on these. I thought that they were a type developed by the Lnyr and drafted into wartime austerity service. Apparently the reverse is true. The class were designed by the Hunslet Company and were adopted as the standard austerity shunting class during the war. They were subsequently acquired by the Lnyr, who gave them the J94 designation. Regardless, this class of saddle tank clearly doesn't fit my prototype. They were never used in LMS service as such, so far as I know, and anyway they date from the 1940s after my period, although they presumably reflect earlier design elements. Models of this class are quite widely available in OO gauge, but not fitting my prototype. Those are not for me. About the only other 060 saddle tank fairly readily available in OO gauge is this old Triang model, sold as R153 back in the 1960s. I have even seen these offered for sale with LMS markings as seen here. But this is all rather iffy. It's not even very clear what the prototype of the Triang model was, possibly some one-off loco from one of the southern companies. I don't think it can really be considered an accurate model of anything. But could it perhaps serve as a basis for an LMS saddle tank with some modifications? Well, it's really not much like the L&YR example. The tank profile is much sharper, the under-tank details totally different, the cab windows different. Here's that L&YR tank here in BR livery. You can see that it's really quite different from both the J94 and the Triang model. Here's a direct comparison of the Triang model and the L&YR locomotive. No matter how much you fiddled with it, it would be difficult to pass the Triang model off as representing the L&YR class. So I was leaning to abandoning that idea. At which point this listing popped up on eBay UK. Listed by Rails of Sheffield. Serendipity, rather. Just as I was thinking of how to add a model of the L&YR saddle tank to my stock, a rare model of this specific class popped up for sale. It wasn't exactly cheap, and it was in BR livery, but I figured that I should be able to change the markings, and for a hand-built example of a loco that I so specifically wanted, I didn't think the price was unreasonable. So I barely hesitated at all before clicking buy it now. This model was built by Works. I didn't really know much about them. I'd heard their name mentioned, but had never really seen any details about their models, let alone actually handling an example. Here's the home page of their website. I'm still a bit unclear as to whether they engineer the models that they sell from scratch themselves or use kits from other companies for the bodies. They certainly seem to have their own standard way of motorizing the models, and they definitely use Romford wheels. They sell their models in quite small batches, and once a batch is gone, it appears that they don't return to that particular model at all. They sell their models fully functional and ready to run, painted and decalled, motorized and with tension-locked couplings fitted. They seem to lean towards specializing in southern locos, although they have branched out occasionally. Oddly enough, when I reviewed their website, they didn't have any models actually currently available for sale, although they were taking pre-orders for a model of the LSWR SR Adams Jubilee 042 tender engine at an asking price around £300. I don't know what they charged for the L&YR tank when they sold that, which according to their site was back in 2009. My model arrived with me in Canada after a couple of weeks. It came very well packed in Works' own box. There was a printed sheet included, giving a bit of information about the prototype class and the normal info about lubrication, maintenance, minimum curves, etc. Here's the reverse of that sheet with body removal and lubrication details. The model didn't provide for DCC fitting. I don't believe that any of Works models do, but this was not a concern for me as I don't use DCC. The model came with fairly standard modern tension-lock couplings, but not NEM pockets. Here is the model out of its box and getting its first run on my little test track. It seemed essentially like a very well-built kit-based loco. The model was extremely heavy, being made essentially entirely out of metal. There was some painted cab detail, but nothing too elaborate, but then the cab isn't easy to see. The cab windows weren't glazed. Sprung buffers were fitted front and rear. There was no coal in the coal bunker, and a body mounting screw is located in the base of the coal bunker, making fitting coal a little tricky. Having established that it would run both forwards and backwards, I took the model down to my workbench, as I intended to proceed immediately with rebadging it as an LMS loco to fit with my prototype. I realised that I haven't really clarified the history of this class, which is designated L&YR Class 23. These locos had a long life, dating well back into the 19th century and continuing in operation, some of them at least, until the 1960s. They started life as 060 tender engines designed by the then locomotive superintendent of the L&YR, William Barton Wright, in the 1870s. In the 1890s, 230 of the Barton Wright tender engines were rebuilt into saddle tanks under the supervision of John Aspinall at the L&YR Horwich Works. All of these passed into LMS service upon amalgamation in 1923. The LMS did withdraw some of them as early as 1926, presumably those that were most worn out. Nevertheless, over 100 of the class survived in service to be passed to British Railways upon nationalisation in 1948, and 20 were still in service in the 1960s. Only one has been preserved, the one seen in operation at the East Lancashire Gala, now finished in its original L&YR livery, although it has also worn BR livery in preservation. I examined the markings of my model closely as I wanted to change it over to LMS markings. It appeared that the decals had been applied over the paintwork with no overcoating being applied afterwards. This was a good thing for me, as I needed to remove at least some of these decals, and removing them would be much easier without overcoating. I examined the model carefully from all angles before starting to work on it. Here's the bottom of the model. There are pickups on the front and back wheels, but not on the centre wheels. The pickups are of a rather odd type, wires rubbing on the outside of the wheel flanges rather than the more conventional wiper pickups pressed against the sides of the wheels. The centre wheels are sprung, allowing quite a bit of up and down movement. All of the wheels have a certain side-to-side movement, but especially the centre ones. As you can see, the couplings are simply screwed in place. They rotate freely from side to side, rather too freely if anything, because they can pivot right over and get caught on the buffers. Here's a close-up of the British Railway's crest, a decal that I definitely wanted to remove. On the sides of the cab were running numbers and a power designation 2F. These locos were used mainly for shunting and also for short-range freight duties. The LMS numbered them in the 11,400 range. Upon nationalisation, British Railways added 40,000 to the numbers, simply changing the initial 1 to a 5. So I figured that I could convert this model back to an LMS number simply by replacing the initial 5 with a 1, although this might be a bit tricky to do. Of course, the small running number on the smoke box would also need to be changed. It appeared that, like the other markings, this had been applied as a simple waterslide decal with no overcoating. I started by working on the BR logo. Since there was no overcoating, I figured that I should be able to remove the decals using microset. I've really always used microset to aid in applying decals, but it also specifically says that it can be used for removing decals. I brushed a good amount of microset onto the decals, waited for a minute or so, and then gently tried to lift the decal with the point of a sharp knife. This basically worked quite well. I wasn't able to lift off the whole decal without breaking it, but I was able to pick it off in sections. Ultimately, I removed all of that initial decal quite successfully, without any apparent damage to the paintwork. I did the same thing on the other side. There are still a couple of little flakes of colour on the tank in this picture, but I was able to clean everything off. For the running numbers, as I said previously, I wanted if possible to just remove the 5 digits, leaving the rest in place, so I brushed microset just onto the 5. After waiting a while, I was able to pick the 5 off. I did cut through the decal between the 5 and the next one before trying to pick the 5 off. Leaving the rest of the markings in place, I did this on both sides of the cab. Then I turned my attention to the smoke box door. This was the most fiddly, as it was the smallest decal, and also it was hard to hold the loco in position to work on this. I did the same thing as for the cab sides, brushing microset just onto the 5 and then picking it off. I now had my model essentially ready to remark for LMS operation. I looked into how the LMS marked these locos. Generally, it seemed, LMS letters were applied quite widely spaced underneath the handrail on the side of the tanks. Running numbers in the 11,400 range were applied to the sides of the cab. This example doesn't actually have a running number on the smoke box door, but given that the plaque was there, I pretty much needed to have a number on my model. In very early LMS use, the engines were apparently marked like this, with a large running number on the side of the tank and LMS cartouches on the sides of the cab. But it was obviously going to be easier for me to mark my model in the other style, and that would be quite appropriate for operation in the 1930s. I used a set of HMRS press-fix decals for crew straw-coloured LMS markings. First, I cut the carrying tissue round 1 digits of the right size, well, almost the right size. I peeled one of these from the backing card and applied it to the side of the cab, doing my best to line it up with the existing number. Then I wet the carrying tissue and removed it. The result wasn't perfect, a bit too small and a bit too dark in colour, but I figured that it would just about pass from a distance. I did the same thing for the running number on the smokebox door. If anything, this worked rather better than the ones on the cab side. I applied LMS letters to the sides of the tanks. I went with using the letters as they were spaced on the HMRS sheet. That might have been a mistake. It might have been better to apply one letter at a time. It would have required more care to get them lined up that way, but I could have spaced them better relative to the riveting of the tank. Still, I didn't think they looked too bad done this way. It's true that they're not best fitted with the tank riveting. But in general, I was fairly happy with my rebadging attempts. I did want to apply an overcoat to protect the decals, so I masked the wheels to avoid spraying moving parts. I put additional pieces of masking tape over the couplings. Here's the model after being sprayed with clear matte acrylic fixative. Even though the fixative is designated matte, the loco is actually shinier than before, but I don't think this finish looks too bad. Here's the view from the other side. When I tried running the model on my Hornby layout, it didn't run too well, hesitating quite a bit. So I got it into the servicing cradle and cleaned the wheels, which were quite dirty, and also did some lubrication. If you look closely here, you can see that there are guard irons at the front and back, which protrude quite a long way down, well, up here, since the model is upside down. I think these may be a bit of a problem, since it seems that they sometimes catch on the interior rails of points. Because there's so much side-to-side play in the wheels, this problem is very intermittent. The model will pass over a set of points 99 times with only the occasional clicking sound, but then will derail on the points the 100th time. If this persists as a significant issue, I'll need to modify the guard irons, but I haven't done so yet. As you can see, the wheels were quite clean after I worked on them. I wasn't very happy with having the coal bunker looking like this. Normally I would have just put some real coal in and fixed it with glue, but that obviously wouldn't be a good idea here, as it would make the body mounting screw inaccessible. So I resorted to just trying to cut some representation of coal from a piece of foam. I cut the foam to shape and jammed it into the coal bunker without gluing it, so it could be easily removed later if necessary to provide access to the body screw. I got the model back onto my Hornby layout to run it in. I gave it a standard 30 minutes forward and 30 minutes backwards, using my baby monitor to monitor the process. In this case, the monitoring proved necessary, as I had to run in a couple of times to fix things when the loco derailed on the points. Obviously, it ran over the points many times without derailing as part of the running-in process, but it did derail once going forwards and a couple of times going backwards. As mentioned, I think this is because of the guard irons protruding from the bottom of the model catching on the inside rails of the points. It required quite a bit of power. I would normally run locos in at 50% power, but given how slow it was, I ran this one in at 75% power. Once the loco was run in, I wanted to hook it up to a little freight train. I had just bought this pair of Graham Farish vans on eBay, so I thought I would use these. Honestly, these Graphar wagons seemed a bit weird. They were rather large, although they're only supposed to be 10-ton vans. and they had rather odd couplings that didn't even want to couple to each other. I got out this old Decals made-in-England brake van to use with the train. This one came to me in grey, and with a little guard figure on the back, I just added LMS letter decals to the sides. Here's that train coupled up, not without some difficulty giving the strange L&YR couplings. Don't those vans really look too big? I mean, they're 10-ton vans, and that's a 20-ton brake van. Anyway, now let's see a little running video of this train. Okay, let me see if I can just get some running for a video of this L&YR Class 23 tank, now rebadged to LMS. And it passes muster as an LMS tank from a distance quite decently. Got these L&YR Graham Farish wagons that I just got on eBay behind it. The Graham Farish wagons really look kind of ridiculously large when we compare them to other things. I wonder if Graham Farish didn't make some errors calculating the scale. And on the back I've got a Decals brake van, which I put LMS decals on. It was already, I didn't repaint it, it was already grey when it came to me, but it had no company decals on the side of it. So it has a little man in the back of it, though, a little guard facing backwards. So let's see if we can get this going and run it. I'm not super confident, we'll see. I had trouble coupling up the Graham Farish wagons. They have weird couplings that didn't even much want to couple to each other. And I did have a couple of problems with derailing of the engine on points during the running in. I suspect due to the guard irons. So let's see what we can do. There, that's about 65%. Does seem to be going a hair faster now it's run in than when it started, but it's geared low, and so it should be, you know, it's a shunting engine. See, I didn't even hear the click as it went over the points then. It was sometimes it clicks as it goes over the points, and I think that's because the guard irons are hitting the internal rails of the points. And it's not a good sign when it starts clicking as it goes over the points. Well, I heard a little click there over the first point, but we'll see. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a derailment on the point, because as I say, I did get a couple of derailments during running in. Never anywhere other than on the points. It's some problem with the point, going over the points. And I haven't just said, oh, I see, I haven't moved the baby monitor. I beg your pardon, I've still got the baby monitor sitting on the baby unit of the baby monitor. I've still got it sitting there on the level crossing where I put it when I'm running engines in. Of course, normally I'd take it off, but I forgot after I ran this in. Not bad. Well, on the whole, I think I'm just going to stop at this point if I can. It's not so easy to stop when I can't look at the controller. But I think I'm really quite pleased with being able to acquire this engine, and I'm quite pleased with how the rebadging of it's gone.